Good morning, everyone. Welcome to God's Grace on Thee and Angel Wallace Productions. Today is Wednesday. It is the 2nd of October of 2024. 10-2. Remember the arms on Mickey Mouse? Disneyland? Well, today is 66 degrees fair and sunny. Now, I had already recorded this particular chapter earlier, only to discover that it came out in Minnie Mouse sound. So I wasted about 2 hours roughly, but that's okay. There's a reason. I look at it this way. There's a reason for everything. And when I woke up, my sinuses were draining, and it was like I was totally interrupted. I didn't want to stop the recording. So in essence, I would have had to do a lot of editing. So I believe that, the forces says, no, let's start over. So I'm glad that you're with me today. In fact, we've got some newcomers, folks. Let me introduce them. I get a lot of people that follow me, and my numbers have not changed in the last 2 years. Now, you tell me, what is going on? I have been suppressed ever since 7 years ago when I had initially been on YouTube, and I had attained over 75,000 followers. And then the Gestapo came and they cut me to the quick, and I couldn't get back on for 6 months. Needless to say, I had to start scouting for other places to get my show back on. And so I don't know what's going on. I just find it rather odd. I've had people tell me that when I respond, they can't see what I'm saying. It's just dashes. So I don't know. Okay, but it's a beautiful day today. It's hump day. We're moving closer to elections. And again, I'm going to reiterate, I do not believe that we'll get to elections. Something has to intervene. Now I've had this premonition, this gut feeling for a long time. And I've been saying that on my platform for a long time, and I've not wavered from that. So it's going to be interesting how things are going to play out. So the only suggestion I can make is keep your head on a swivel. And there's a reason for everything, and that's why we have to keep our head on a swivel, because we don't know what's coming next. It's like we're walking through Universal Studios over there, where they have a place where you can walk through to get scared. I don't know what they call that. Some attraction over there. So that's basically what it is. You don't know what's going to come out of the alley. You don't know what's going to be at the store waiting for you. You just have no idea. And the massive amount of illegals coming over. I mean, you've got the Haitians, the Venezuelans, and so many more. And they're coming in hordes, in groups, young men. And okay, so I got off on a tangent. So let's get back to our new subscribers. Quadrason, Venkata 54, Mind Mechanic, Susie Fahrenheit 100, Butterballs, Oh my goodness, I like that. STS2 Sunny, Attagirl 777, and Q Space Force. Welcome to the channel. I appreciate your stopping by and subscribing. We always have fun on this channel. I bring a lot of information to you, a lot of truth. And I hope that you share the videos with others. The more we awaken, the quicker things happen. What we're going to be talking about today is global disarmament. So let's get started. Chapter 18, recording number 1. Now this first intro here is Jesus, or Sananda, as we know him in the Phoenix Journals. Merry Christmas and Happy Newton Day. On this early Christmas morning, I come to sit with you for a while, Dharma. I see the sadness in your heart, the heaviness, the acknowledgement that things are not easier nor abundant than that of last year and the year before. No, precious ones, the world is not better this season. It is far worse than in all of history. Bits of colored paper, Christmas trees, and turkey dinners will not make of it better. We are doing here that which will make it better. Aho. Much propaganda is strewn about during the holy seasons, that no one notices that which is going on. Your military leaders say they ran Noriega to the ground. They ran him nowhere. This invasion of Panama has run the peoples to the ground. They have no food. Their businesses are destroyed. People killed. And yet the lie abounds. One act of terrorism does not diminish the doubling of terrorism. That police force shall overrun your homes if you do not act before the day. That which will happen now in those beloved places that have stood and fought and died for freedom is that they shall now fall prey to the beast and the cartel, just as planned. They will find they must borrow and accept aid, for they cannot function without assistance. They will simply now sell their countries to the mongrels. So be it. It is headed for your local doorsteps, wherever you abide in this world. There are many ones this day who have set aside the festivities to finish our work in a timely manner. You only feel isolated and alone. You must do these things for the wondrous peace within, for few of your fellow man shall give appreciation to you ones who carry of the banner. It is the way of the journey. There is not reverence unto me this day in your masses. It is a most holy day for material-oriented Satan. They even dub his name Santa. How sad for mankind. So be it, Chela. Let us move onward, for every day is most precious indeed. I give the benediction of peace unto you ones of truth, and rest in the promise that your works will be blessed. The King of Darkness reigns this day, not the Prince of Light. You were told it would be thusly brought to bear. Do not dismay, for we have much to do. I am Sananda of God, the captain of this ship, and you shall be given the way. Adonai. Hatan present in love and truth, Chela. that we may do our work in a timely manner. Walk in light this day. Hold the beauty of the day which brings man a bit closer together within the heart place, close to your own. For you must not go in the forgetting of that which we are here to do. The word must go forth, and then man must decide of that which he will do with it. The global police force. Oh yes, it is coming, and it is coming down hard. You already taste of it in the judicial system, which is corrupt and evil, in the IRS, which is corrupt and evil, and even in your local law enforcers, who are chosen for their intent of control and power. Of course, there are good men among the groups, but oh, chela, so few in these days of preparation for the big changes. There can be no wondrously warm and gentle men in the forces which shall carry out the orders of the elite. Did you not see the children in the military circumstance in Panama? They are but youngsters who do the bidding of the hardened and evil-oriented directors. Did you see Mr. Bush or Mr. Cheney in the fray? Nay, they sat and gave little tokens of how fair and just was your son's death to the ones who would never overcome the loss of a beloved life stream. And the generals sit in their air-conditioned rooms and direct the death marches, and citizens back at home pronounce opinions of nonsense. War is a stupid ploy of evil. But you have billions of war toys. Therefore, you have to use them on something. Do you not? So be it. Cartel spokesmen complain that a weakness of the United Nations has been its lack of enforcement action against aggressor nations. On cinching up the enforcement authority of the cartel's global bureaucracy, Richard Gardner says, finally, we will need to find better ways of enforcing the rules as by multilateral action that denies benefits and applies punishments. Military force is needed to punish nations who do not conform to world law, as promulgated by the world government. Therefore, according to Richard Falk, the creation of an unchallengeable global police authority is a first and central priority. The name of the game is domination. Now he says, again, disarmament can proceed successfully only if accompanied by centralization of the power authority structure that dominates the newly disarmed units, hence nations. In 1961, the United States State Department, operating under iron-fisted control of cartel agents, issued State Department Publication 7277. Now this document explains the master plan for creating a global police force that will dominate all disarmed nations, including the United States. And it reads in part, set forth as the objectives of a program of general and complete disarmament in a peaceful world, the disbanding of all national armed forces and the prohibition of their re-establishment in any form whatsoever, other than those required to preserve internal order and for contributions to the United Nations Peace Force. The elimination from national arsenals of all armaments, including all weapons of mass destruction, and the means for their delivery, other than those required for a United Nations Peace Force and for maintaining internal order. will the establishment and effective operation of an international disarmament organization within the framework of the United Nations to ensure compliance with all disarmament obligations. And no state would have military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. John F. Kennedy was groomed for his presidency at the cartel's Fabian Socialist London School of Economic and Political Science. Kennedy submitted to a disarmament committee in Geneva a treaty called Blueprint for the Peace Race. The key provision of this formal treaty is the creation of a United Nations peacekeeping force, so powerful that no nation could defy its dictates. And this proposal is still pending. The United Nations already has the power to police the world. All nations which have signed the UN Charter agree to, number one, permit the UN Security Council to deploy UN military forces against a perceived enemy by air, sea, or land as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. That's in Article 42 of the UN Charter, Chapter 7. Number 2, provide the UN every assistance for its military actions and refrain from giving assistance to a nation against which the UN is taking preventative or enforcement action. Article 2, the UN Charter, Chapter 1. Number 3, make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including rites of passage, and make immediately available National Air Force contingents for combined international enforcement action. Article 45 of the UN Charter, Chapter 7. Thus, in the name of peace, the United Nations Charter creates and empowers a global aggressor with authority to wage war against individual nations. And as articulated by J. Reuben Clark, Jr., who served as a U.S. Undersecretary of State, quote, "The Charter will not certainly end war. In the first place, there is no provision in the Charter itself that contemplates ending war. It is true that the Charter provides for force to bring peace, but such use of force is in itself war. The Charter is a war document, not a peace document. Further, Americans must understand that, number 1, although the UN Security Council decides whether or not to take enforcement action, the actual control and command of UN troops belongs to the Undersecretary General for the Department of Political and Security Council Affairs. And number 2, the Undersecretary General for the Department of Political and Security Council Affairs has always been and will in the future always be appointed by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now, this is per an agreement between the United States and the Soviet delegates attending the first meeting of the UN General Assembly in London in 1945. Right now, the UN Undersecretary General for the Department of Political and Security Council Affairs is Soviet official Vasily S. Sanfranchuk. Sanfranchuk is number 1 authority in charge of all UN military personnel, peacekeeping missions, disarmament, and atomic energy matters. And once the cartel completes its disarmament plan, all disarmed nations of the world will be policed by the Soviet Communist Party working through the United Nations as a front. Understand the dominators. You can project the fate of all nations slated to be dominated by the Soviet-operated World Police Force by looking at what the United Nations Security Council did to Africa in the early 60s. Now at that time, the Belgian Congo, now Zaire, was under the brutal control of Soviet proxy and terrorist Patrice Lumumba. Now Lumumba had issued a directive calling for imprisonment and torture of those who resisted his dictatorship. Anti-communist leader Moise Tshobe, backed by a large army, organized the province of Katanga to secede from Lumumba's terrorist state. Now Tshobe declared that under his leadership, Katanga would enjoy a Western-style government based on the principles drawn from the U.S. Constitution. Tshobe greatly admired the U.S. Constitution. So by resolution of the UN Security Council, thousands of UN troops under the command of Soviet official George Arkadev were transported by U.S. Air Force planes to peaceful Little Katanga. Their mission was to help the Marxist terrorist Lumumba put a bloody end to Tshobe's ideas of self-determination. Now Lumumba's troops, backed by the UN forces, swarmed through Katanga on a rampage of rape and murder and cannibalism. So savage were their acts against civilians, including women and children, that one journalist, an eyewitness, called them wild barbarians, determined to annihilate the last bastion of civilization that remains in Katanga. Now 46 medical doctors observing hideous massacres sent this urgent message to John F. Kennedy and the Pope. SOS to the moral conscience of the world. Stop. Implore you to intervene with all your authority to stop the terrorist bombardment of hospitals, civilian populations by UNO on our honor. As physicians, we declare as lies the denials of UNO Secretary General. The UN Secretary General was Leninist U Thant. He was a world-renowned humanitarian. A Dr. Albert Schweitzer also demanded that the UN troops be withdrawn from Katanga, and he declared that the mission of the United Nations should not be to make war. A U.S. senator present in the Congo during the UN operations there testified before the Senate that the United Nations had brought chaos and bloodshed to the Congo. But mass genocide has always been a part of the plan. The cartel cannot consolidate its socialist world order if independent leaders establish little niches of freedom. Thus, the UN forces annihilated Tshobe's liberation movement, and they brought the Congo under absolute control of Lumumba's Marxist successor, Cyril Adula, and his dictatorship was called peace. The United Nations still operates exclusively in the interests of the Marxists' agenda. Thus, in 1988, Gorbachev called for the UN intervention in Afghanistan. Watch for an accelerating increase in deployment of UN forces to trouble spots throughout the world. Third world dictators will call for UN assistance. The Soviets will acquiesce to UN peacekeeping arrangements like that in the works for Marxist Angola, where the UN will undoubtedly help annihilate anti-communist forces there. And while the dupes of the West are told that UN troops are preventing global conflagration, nation after nation will be sucked into the New World Order by Vasily Sanfranchuk and his Kremlin bosses. Consider the 1988 agreement. It was arrangement by the U.S. State Department and signed by the Marxist dictators of Angola and Cuba, under which the African nation of Namibia is to be brought to totalitarian independence. Now under this agreement, 7,500 UN troops and 1,500 World Order bureaucrats will supervise the withdrawal from Namibia of South African troops, the disarmament of Namibian territorial forces, and the transfer from Marxist Angola to Namibia by 9,000 Soviet-backed, Cuban-trained SWAPO guerrillas, renowned for their terrorist atrocities against civilians. The radical Marxist SWAPO, Southwest African People's Organization, is recognized as the sole and authentic representative of Namibia by the United Nations. Thus, Vasily Sanfranchuk and his UN police force are authorized to supervise Namibian elections in order to place SWAPO leaders in control of what will certainly emerge as a Marxist dictatorship. The fate of Namibians will be that of all Soviet slaves. Installing a SWAPO dictatorship in Namibia will cost the United Nations $600 million. That's 1/3 of which will be paid by the American taxpayers. As Congress discusses innovative ways to plunder the American bourgeois in order to reduce the budget deficit, not one self-serving politician will dare suggest that instead of raising taxes, perhaps the Namibian Sovietization project should be cut from the U.S. UN budget. SWAPO took Namibia in November of 1989. Bind it together. Because the plan calls for a world police force dominated by the Soviets, it is little wonder that Saul Mendelovitz, chief theoretician for the World Order Models Project, openly admits that the world government is likely to evolve into a totalitarian entity. He has stated, "It is my considered judgment that there is no longer a question whether or not there will be world government by the year 2000. As I see it, the questions we should be addressing ourselves to are, how will it come into being? By cataclysm, drift, rational design, and whether it will be totalitarian, benign, or participatory. The probabilities being in that order. The world order propagandists defend the totalitarian aspect of the plan by insisting that only through coercion can socialist bureaucrats save the world from fear and economic privation. The cartel's Radical Americans for Democratic Action has stated that it is possible for a police state to be obedient to the popular will. Now, this is typical Marxist propaganda, which contends that populations enduring a police state gladly impose upon themselves the strangulating terror of martial law. Now, the cartel elite have always stressed that a police state is necessary for control of the bovine masses. It is greatly relevant, as we documented earlier, that Doug Dillon, guiding force behind the World Order Models Project and advocate of radical constitutional reform, is inextricably connected to the rise of Hitler and the National Socialist movement of Nazi Germany. Consider also the personal philosophy of John Foster Dulles, now founding father of the United Nations and U.S. Secretary of State. Dulles was related to the Rockefeller family by marriage. And through his law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, Dulles arranged financing for Adolf Hitler. He also served as Joseph Stalin's legal counsel in the United States. In 1940, Dulles outlined what he considered the virtues of totalitarianism. I quote, "How are we to overcome the obstacles created by pride and selfishness? We can get rid of them only by replacing by some sentiment more dominant and gripping, and which will contain in it the elements of universality against particularity. This is no visionary dream. Before us today we have the spectacle of communism and fascism changing almost overnight the characteristics of entire peoples. Millions of individuals have been made into different and, on the whole, finer people. Elemental virtues are again treated as matters of concern. Immoralities and dishonestness, personal prides and prejudices are replaced by courage, self-sacrifice, and discipline. There is a conscious subordination of self to the end, that some great objective may be furthered. George Bernard Shaw, godfather of the Fabian Society, founded by British disciples of Karl Marx, and an ardent supporter of the plan, also expressed delight with brutal dictatorship. In 1931, during the heyday of Stalin's psychotic purges, Shaw toured Russia on behalf of the cartel's European faction. It is a real comfort to me, an old man, to be able to step into my grave with the knowledge that the civilization of the world will be saved. It is here in Russia that I have actually been convinced that the new communist system is capable of leading mankind out of its present crisis and saving it from complete anarchy and ruin. Bertrand Russell, another world order pioneer and an active leader of parliamentarians for world government, was an adamant proponent of a global police authority. He explained why the global disarmament plan will not alleviate the threat of nuclear weapons. And when I speak of international government, I mean one that really governs, not an amiable facade like the League of Nations or a pretentious sham like the United Nations under its present constitution. An international government must have the only atomic bombs, the only plant for producing them, the only air force, the only battleships, and generally whatever is necessary to make it irresistible. Richard Falk emphasizes the Central Guidance System will maintain a nuclear arsenal to enforce its dictates. The goal of disarmament will be to eliminate national military establishments, and residual and nominal nuclear arsenals of fixed specifications will be maintained in 10 centers of power and authority, each subject to dual control activation and requiring the participation of a designated official or his appointed deputy. Now, once the cartel's global bureaucracy becomes the irresistible nuclear power, it will have the means to enforce a brutal global police state. Are you getting a bit anxious to get those survival shelters? Dr. Leo Szilard, a top scientist for the Manhattan Project, told a group of scientists in 1961, "It is my contention that the only way to make the court, the world court, effective is to empower the court to impose the death penalty for failure to appear in court when summoned. The court would deputize any and all American citizens to try and execute the sentence. An American citizen killing an outlaw could not be legally tried for murder in an American court, inasmuch as the treaty setting up the court would be the law of the land. In addition to relying on American citizens, thus deputized, the court could employ perhaps 500 to 1,000 marshals. It would be the duty of the marshals to try to execute the death sentence imposed by the court." Now, the plan calls for regional police reserves of 50,000 to 75,000 per unit. These regional forces, controlled by the Central Police Authority, would ensure that all citizens obey the orders of world government bureaucrats. Richard Falk notes, "Participation in these security activities would be a great honor and would be rewarded with high pay. Members would receive a sophisticated education and would be expected to be exemplary citizens of the world policy. Not good citizens, but rather exemplary citizens of the world policy." Cartel theoretician Payson S. Wild Jr. admitted years ago that if a world government is to be effective, individual citizens must be terrorized into submission by the world police, apparently envisioning a global version of the KGB, he wrote. "Dealing with an entire state as a criminal has a psychological as well as military and other practical difficulties, but international police would not confine their functions to operations against whole nations. They could and should operate against individual persons. In fact, the main job of such a force may be that of enforcing law against private persons. As an evolutionary step towards a global police state, the cartel created through its congressional puppets the Omnibus Crime Control Act of 1968. Now, this legislation engendered the Federal Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, along with numerous state laws and federal funding schemes. LEAA is gradually forging local police forces, county sheriff's departments, and National Guard units into a centrally controlled national police force. Now, this computerized national law enforcement network is slated to fall under the jurisdiction of the global police force sometime around the year 2000. Remember, the U.S. State Department has announced that the ultimate goal is general and complete disarmament, including individual Americans, since privately owned weapons could be used to challenge global authority. Now, Lenin, who led the cartel-backed Russian Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, commanded his terrorists to make mass searches and hold executions for found arms. And he declared, only the Soviets can effectively disarm the bourgeois. Unless this is done, the victory of socialism is impossible. Now, the world order propagandists ridicule Americans who own arms as warmongers and Rambo types. Richard Falk complains, prevailing ethical attitudes in the United States support domestic reliance on the war system. The failure of Congress to enact effective legislation prohibiting handgun sales is indicative. The cartel program of dynamic gradualism has placed increasingly burdensome requirements on the private ownership of firearms. Gun registration is, according to former Congressman John Rarick, the forerunner of arms confiscation. After relinquishing all her weapons to a Soviet-dominated global police force slated to enforce the edicts of the World Court, the United States will cease to be a sovereign nation state. America will be considered merely a regional unit of the cartel's global eco-political system. The cartel has been very blatant about the ultimate design of the plan, but nowhere have we found a more brazen declaration than that of cartel dignitary Walt Rostow, in his day chairman of the State Department Policy Planning Board. And Rostow announced, "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests, since this residual right is the root of national sovereignty and the basis for the existence of an international arena of power. It is therefore an American interest to see an end to nationhood as it has been historically defined." So be it, Chela, let us allow this to seep within the brains while you take respite. Please do not longer hide your heads in the buckets of dirt. Everything has been planned. From the drugs to lull you into stupor, to the rise of Satanism, to the false war on drugs, to get you behind all efforts to control and do something about this problem. Well, they are doing something about your problems. I hope you are ready for a long, hard, and cold winters and a lot of bloodshed. Yours. When we return, we shall discuss how the machine runs. It is expected that you, stupid capitalist American citizens, will surrender while pleading for more controls. Capitalists have traditionally surrendered with far more cowardice than the Marxist scheme predicted. And that, dear friends, came from cartel historian, author Schlesinger, presidential advisor to John F. Kennedy. How safe do you feel this day? And what do you think they might have been doing since they murdered Mr. Kennedy? Think about it. I moved to stand by that we might draw this segment to a close. Thank you for your willing service on this your Christmas Day holiday, and blessings be unto you and yours on this day of remembering. Salud.